Hi, I'm David Tao, and welcome to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, this is the second program in our series Theories of Civilization, in which we take a bird's eye view of the flow and evolution of civilization from the very earliest times, from the very earliest hominids and humans on this planet, right through to the present time and on into the future. Virtually the whole swathe of human history. But what we're looking for in this three-part series are the common factors, the factors that tie all civilizations together, from the very earliest ancient empires right through to the current state of our amazing state of our civilization today, and then look at its prognosis. We're looking for patterns that are independent, if you like, of the individual events that have occurred, all the trillions of events that have occurred in human history. In our first program, we discovered some of those patterns, some of those commonalities. We looked at the start, right back to the start of human history, when early hominids split from the great apes around 6 million years ago, and then went through a series of transitions from Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, to the present time, to the present Homo sapiens, that emerged around 150,000 years ago in the Rift Valley of Africa, and whose brains are basically the same as ours today. Through chains of mutations, through chains of evolution, they evolved for the first time around 150,000 years ago with exactly the same cognitive abilities that we have today, or virtually the same. Now, during that time, from about 150,000 years ago to around 50,000 years ago, they started to evolve the sort of artefacts with which we're familiar. They started to speak languages, for example, quite sophisticated languages eventually. Even 50,000 years ago, they started to paint. They started to use tools, sophisticated tools. Earlier humans, earlier hominids had used tools, simple stone axes, etc. But the new tools were much more sophisticated. And so it went right through until the great ice age thaw, around about 13,000 years ago, creating the vast alluvial plains, cornucopia of fertility that became our planet at that point. And then civilization got a boost, because at that time the hunter-gatherers, the early Homo sapiens, began to settle down. They settled on these major plains, they settled on other minor river plains as well. But the major areas of civilization evolved on the major river flats. For example, the Euphrates and Tigris in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, the Nile Valley in Egypt, even in the modern Americas, in the New World of the Americas, in the Amazon basin, in the Mexican basin, high in the Andes as well, the Indus River in India, and so it goes, the Yangtze in China. They became the major centres of civilization. And our modern humans quickly educated themselves. They basically learnt the 3 R's. They quickly evolved systems of numbers and writing to keep track of their newfound wealth, of their grains, of their new ways of storing those grains in pots. They kept track of the numbers of cattle they domesticated. And so they needed this system to do that. And in each of the major centres this occurred. And it occurred, as we found in the last program, independently. In other words, some centres had time to communicate with each other. The Greeks may have communicated with the Indian civilization at various points. All civilizations intermingled later on. But at the beginning they didn't intermingle, but yet they developed common protocols, common rituals for evolving their own civilization. And they all included early forms of writing, for example the Egyptians, the Mayans in Mexico, hieroglyphic types of writing. In the Middle East, cuneiform writing based on pictographs. And so it went. And eventually running writing, ordinary writing as well, which evolved from the Phoenicians, a later group. And so, apart from being able to keep records now, they also developed sophisticated crafts. As I said, sophisticated pots, sophisticated leatherwork, textiles, jewellery, and so on, sophisticated carvings. All these things evolved because they had time to do them, and also because they needed to do them to keep their societies, if you like, under control. So gradually, or very quickly in fact, from around about 12,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, towns and villages sprang up, administrative techniques, early neo-political techniques evolved, crafts, tools, weapons, etc. Weapons were needed, of course, because they needed to, again, defend their territory, and so also peasants were conscripted to form the first defence forces, the first armies. So all the artefacts of civilization started to evolve at that stage, and we arrive at the program this week, we arrive around about 6,000 years ago, from 6 million to 6,000 years. And at this point in time, 6,000 years ago, the first cities and the first city-states and the first empires started to evolve. So viewers, by this time, humans were flying down the road of history, flying down the road of civilization. They were beginning to build their own history, their own stories and their own myths. For example, their early administrative records were the first recorded history. Who'd sold what to whom, who'd bought what, how much they'd paid, and what their relationship was within the hierarchy, the stratification of the society. These were the first records that archaeologists had been able to use to piece together early histories of these societies. They evolved again from villages to towns, from clans and tribes and feudal fiefdoms, and gradually certain of the towns got larger and evolved into cities. They were the hubs, if you like, the hubs particularly of the trading networks. These cities became central to trade because all civilizations began to develop trading networks. They needed the resources to manufacture their products, their metal products, for example. By this time, copper was being widely used. Copper had started to be used as a metal from about 5,000 years ago, even further back. And of course later, in the Bronze Age, around about 4,500 years ago, it was combined with tin to form bronze, which was tougher. Bronze was needed to make, and copper to make pots for cooking, utensils for example, for the middle class by this stage, as well as the armies, footwear, clothing, and of course for the upper class, for the aristocrats, it was necessary to have jewellery, it was necessary to have body decorations of various sorts made out of metals, gold, silver, to start with, because that was easy to use. It was native. It was in its native form. Copper had to be smelted. Basically, they needed to trade those metal ores, timber, food, everything to create and to provide their populations with an ever-growing hunger for these sorts of artefacts of civilization, some being essential but some not so essential. The process was driven by the need for resources. It was also driven by the sheer power of some of the leaders of these groups. The groups and the major cities began to develop into the city-states, into a form you could call the city-state, because each major city, such as for example Athens or Rome, gathered around them minor villages, minor towns, and all related, all using the same common language, the same culture. And they formed the first city-states by a normal, natural, simple process of positive feedback. And And these city-states basically began to trade with each other, as I said. They began to war with each other as well. All of them, by the way, all the major cities and the city-states, if they were to survive, had to have sophisticated administrative structures and sophisticated socio-political structures as well. At this stage, for example, in Athens, in the major cities such as Athens, embryonic social political structures were evolving. And of course Athens is the most famous one, being known as the home of true democracy, in which the ordinary person was included in the decision process, could make their case and take it, if necessary, to arbitration. And they were on equal terms with the wealthier classes and the more favoured classes. So this was the first true democracy, the first political body, the Athenian polity, and but others had a more hierarchical structure, a quasi-democracy in many cases, such as in Rome, the Republic of Rome, in which the patricians and plebeians, those at the top of the power tree, if you like, and those at the bottom, were supposed to have a similar input, but didn't. But regardless, if city-states, for example, and eventually nations and empires, were to survive, they needed to draw the common person, the common people, into the decision process. They had to be made feel part of it. That's what all democracies are about, and that's was equally true in those early times, from 5,000, 6,000 years ago to onward from there. That was the basis of the political process. Of course, in most cases, it originated from groups of elders, as it still can do today in some countries. Groups of elders representing the common people, and the wise ones, in other words, the ones who'd gained knowledge, and they would make group decisions based on consensus. So, but again, the evolution continued. Administration had to become sophisticated because, for example, tax had to be collected. If the nation-state was to continue in a viable way, because there were public buildings, there were drainage works, irrigation works had to be built. There were massive palaces which contained not only where the hierarchy, the higher kings and nobles, etc., lived, but also contained workshops and grain storage areas, etc. Temples became a huge feature because on the religious side of things, humans had figured out that something had to create all this wonderful, bountiful world that they lived in, and someone, that entity, could also make things tough for them as well. They could send droughts and floods as well as bountiful harvests, so they had to be kept happy. So the ordinary people set up shrines, religious shrines, but they grew into public, as I said, into public infrastructure, huge temples, and eventually into funeral structures such as pyramids and ziggurats and so forth in, for example, Mayan culture. So all the early proto-civilizations, which were nation-states, in other words, developed these structures often independently, just as they had in earlier times developed writing and numbers independently as well. So this is a fairly transparent logical process. If you take any of these major civilizations, if you take the Maya in Mexico, the Incas in the Andes, if you take the major civilizations in the Indus Valley, and in Mesopotamia, for example, in the Middle East, if you take in China, wherever, you find similar structures developing, keeping track of what's going on, building and trading, of course, as well. And of course, by this time, those groups of elders, those groups of citizens had elected kings, emperors, rulers. They had originally elected someone who could represent them and lead them in war, but also eventually who would represent them in peacetime. And the whole concept of kingship developed, and often hereditary kingship, so that the king's son became the next king. dynasties in fact developed. A dynasty being a particular line of a ruler which might go on for 3 or 4 generations. But within one proto-empire there could be, as there were in, for example, Egypt, up to 25 or more dynasties, each with several generations, including several generations. But I'm getting a little ahead there because we're still basically in the city-states. The city-states needed to trade, and eventually, of course, they all went to war. Now, there are 2 types of war, 2 types of strife. Civil strife internally, if things weren't going well, and the rulers weren't doing the right thing, and the resources weren't available, or the taxes were too high, and of course external wars, where one city-state tried to dominate others. Usually these city-states were pretty much independent with their own form of government, their own culture, their own rules and protocols, even if fairly similar. So there were city-states in Greece, early Italy of course, city-states in the early dynasties of China, run by the early dynasties of China and India, and all the great civilised centres, all had evolved this structure from towns to city-states. And again, all of them started to fight each other for dominance. For example, in Rome, of course, Athens and the city-states of Athens and Sparta fought many battles until eventually Athens became the major centre. Babylon became the major centre in the Middle East, initially anyway. And again, each major area of civilization went through this process of enormous battles, often over hundreds and hundreds of years, until one state emerged supreme, one major dynasty, and then you began the first major unified empires, if you like. One achieved dominance over the others, the whole lot became unified within a major area, and that began the first empires. So viewers, let's do a brief flyover of some of these fabulous ancient empires that emerged around 6,000 years ago. All from early indigenous tribes and clans and feudal groups, gradually merging into cities, into city-states, and then developing further into empires. But these empires weren't necessarily stable either, because quite often an empire would collapse for whatever reasons. It might be the reasons of drought or flood or earthquake, or it might be just because their resources weren't sufficient to stand up to larger empires, and or sometimes civil strife within as well led to their collapse. Poor economic management, poor administration. So empires just didn't sort of come into being and last. They also often collapsed, and there was realignment. Diplomacy emerged, of course, during this time in a big way. I mean, kings and rulers did different deals with each other to achieve their ends, whatever they were, then dissolved those pacts, those treaties. They exchanged letters, they exchanged gifts with each other, they married each other's daughters, they did all sorts of things to achieve the ends that they wanted to achieve. So in Mesopotamia, for example, there were early empires. The Assyrian Empire dominated around about 3,200 years ago, after previous mergings and collapses of earlier groups. The Canaanites and the Phoenicians, for example, were a major group, as were the Sumerians about 5,500 years ago. But the Assyrian Empire only lasted till about 2,600 years, around about 600 years in all, and then it was defeated by the Babylonians, which combined to deal with another group called the Medes. But of course they were defeated by the Persians. The Persian Empire, around about 2540. The Persian Empire had evolved in Iran, present-day Iran, again from earlier groups, but emerged as a force in around 2600 as the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great, in fact, and then various other kings, rulers, Darius, for example, the Darius 1, 2 and 3, and his son. But they captured Babylonia, as I say, around 2540, and but went into economic decline soon after, and they'd also at that stage captured part of Egypt and Anatolia, but Egypt started to revolt. So you get collapses in empires often because indigenous groups that have previously been captured end up revolting and wanting their own territory back again, which is pretty natural and still occurs right through modern history. So Darius III in about 2330 was defeated by Alexander the Great, the Greeks in turn. So they had defeated the Middle East empires and in turn were defeated by the Greeks. The early Greek civilization is probably the one that's best known because of the amazing flowering of culture as well as democracy that took place there. It started perhaps around 4200 years ago in Crete in the Minoan Empire, the Minoan civilization, with amazing palaces, for example, at Knossos being built, quite a sophisticated civilization, but that was usurped by the mainlanders, the Greek mainlanders, the Mycenaeans, and around about 3450. And around about 2800, the city-states, there was a rise of city-states at that stage, and a number of wars, and from that period emerged the two main contenders, Sparta and Athens. And it was at Athens that this amazing flowering took place because of the way it was administered, I guess. Again, democracy allowed input by everyone. There was a free exchange of ideas. There was no control process that said you can only talk about such and such, you can only say such and such. So around about 2750, for example, after the emergence of writing, the original Phoenician alphabet vowels were added by the Greeks, and from oral histories to writing histories we have the works of Homer, the Iliad, Odyssey, and of course the major playwrights as well emerged, Sophocles, Euripides. Around about this time, viewers, we also see the emergence of other strands of culture critical to the future of any civilization. Mathematics and philosophy, for example. Mathematics is self-evident. It's needed for the accurate measurement of public buildings, navigation. Philosophy less evident, but still just as critical. Important for the flow of ideas and creativity. For the emergence of great philosophers, the great Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, earlier ones such as Anaxagoras. But not only in the Greek states were these ideas developing, were these forms developing, but in the civilizations of China and India around about this time as well. The two great Chinese philosophers around 2500 years ago, Confucius and Lao Tzu, who laid the groundwork for much of cultural innovation at that time, and still play a major role. There's a return of the value of Confucianism in China at the moment. So, on all these fronts, culture developed, but unfortunately, quality of a civilization's culture does not necessarily determine or predict its survival. And in 2200 years ago, Greek civilization succumbed to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had been bubbling away since the Etruscans 3,000 years ago, but took its major form, the major form of the Republic, based around Rome, around 2,500 years ago also. When it covered basically, when it subsumed the whole of the Italian peninsula. But this was only the beginning of the Roman Empire, because under Julius Caesar's reign from 2050 on, the empire grew enormously in power and in area. And we see the rise from then on of that major empire, the Roman Empire, and of course, eventually its decline. Viewers, we could talk forever about these early, amazing civilizations and their achievements. The achievements on which we all depend today. Their early innovations, the wheel, the chariot, plough, the pulley, the techniques they devised to move giant blocks of stone and build the pyramids and the Stonehenges. The architectural techniques that they evolved to build fabulous palaces and temples, performance spaces, public infrastructure like roads and walls. We could talk forever about their arts and crafts, which still stun us today, and are on exhibition in places like the Australian Museum. all the wonderful fine gold work and silver and precious stones, all the carvings, all the fabulous pottery and painting, all the textile work. All of these things they had to evolve from scratch, all these innovations, including how to govern, the social structure, the political structures, how to negotiate, how to form alliances, how to trade, and how to run wars. But in this program, in this series, we're looking for patterns. And we've really discovered them, these underlying innovations that run civilisations. We've looked at the way they've independently developed number and writing systems across all civilisations. We've looked at the way they've developed their political systems, administration, keeping the records. We've looked at the way they've developed their structures for farming and for building public works and for developing their concepts of religion. They've all followed these same patterns. However, we're coming to a critical threshold in the evolution of civilisations. We're coming to a point where these early civilisations start to split into two groups. One group powers ahead with innovations such as steel that give them a critical edge in warfare, for example, and techniques of boat building. The others stay fairly constant, stay where they are vulnerable. So we see that the next generation of civilisations will take advantage of this differential, and they will use it to go out and try to conquer the world. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.